Okay, so here we go with the nervous system review still. Here we have cerebrum. Again, you can kind of go through your anatomy, what you remember, what you don't remember, and maybe, review that in your anatomy books as well. But I think the books do a good job of kind of going through some of these. Diencephalon, and then we talked about the mesencephalon, the pons to the hypothalamus, integration of visual, auditory, and writing reflexes. The hindbrain, pons medulla, and the pons and medulla, again, responsible for respiration, sleep, reflexes like sneezing, heart rate. I mean, things that we cannot control, certainly. Cerebellum connects the brainstem through the bundles of fiber tracts, and it's concerned with involuntary movement mainly, things that we cannot control. And then we have nervous tissue, which is made up of our cell bodies, axons, and dendrites. And then there are afferent, efferent, and interneurons. I don't know if you guys remember the nerves that move away from the brain to the accessory nerves, and then nerves that move back to the brain. So you have the to and from neurons, and then the ones that meet in between. Synapses and neurotransmitters. So again, at each level of the nervous system, the impulses are generated through this direction of a synapse. And there is a picture of it on page 34 in your book. And this is where the exchange of neurotransmitters takes place. Okay, so this is called an impulse transmission at the synapse level. And this is why we focus a little bit on the neurotransmitters, because in mental health, often and most often, these neurotransmitters are either getting too much activity or not enough activity. And so we found that we can connect these chemical relationships to certain disorders that we'll be talking about. The neurotransmitters are released from the little vesicles inside these synapses. They cross the synaptic cleft and they bind with receptor sites on the cell body or the dendrites. And that's how the impulses are carried through and on their way to the brain, of course. So the autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, you guys are probably familiar with that. There's a lot of drugs that affect both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, so it's really important for you to have a good understanding of those. So the sympathetic kicks in stressful situations like the fight or flight, where your heart rate's going to go up and your pulse, your heart rate and your blood pressure are going to go up. So think of that system as the increasing everything system. Everything's going to be heightened and go up. And the parasympathetic is the opposite. Everything is going to be relaxed and go down, okay? There are some situations where that is not always the case, but think of sympathetic as the fight or flight, and think of the parasympathetic as the rest and digest. Okay, that's a good way to remember those. So here we have a couple of examples. Well, two sides of examples of what the parasympathetic and the sympathetic is doing. I love this diagram because it really shows you what's happening in the body related to those two systems. So we're going to talk about neurotransmitters. These are going to be key to understanding some of the disorders that you run into. So cholinergics. This is the part where we deal with acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is one of the most important and one of the first recognized neurotransmitters. But its functions are many, including sleep, arousal, pain perception, coordination of movement, memory, and retention of memory. And this neurotransmitter, plays a significant role in things like Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's. Monoamines, Also, think of norepinephrine. This neurotransmitter produces activity in the fight or flight responses. So if you think about this one, it's gonna, heighten those responses. If it's not returned properly to the axon terminals of the neurons, it is metabolized and inactivated by MAO. So think of the drugs that relate to doing that in the body. So it also, norepinephrine regulates mood, cognition, perception, locomotion, cardiovascular functioning, sleep, and arousal. So it's been implicated in depression, mania or manic, anxiety states, and in schizophrenia. And then dopamine dopamine is another one, a monoamide. Dopamine functions to regulate movement, coordination, emotions, voluntary decision making. It has an influence on the pituitary gland, releasing prolactin. It increased levels are associated with mania and schizophrenia. So there is a table on page 36 and 37. I would get to know that table a little bit, and it'll say serotonin, decreased levels can cause depression, increased levels can cause anxiety, or histamine, decreased levels can cause depression. So just kind of review all of those. And the so we've got the amino acids, the gamma, cycline, and glutamate, and aspartate. Okay, and you'll see increased and decreased levels on that chart. And then neuropeptides, endorphins, and enkephalins, substance P, and somatostatin. So these neuropeptides also, again, if there's decreased levels, Huntington's disease, and Alzheimer's disease, increased levels can cause depression, decreased levels of, so it depends on the neuropeptide. So take a look and see what you, maybe you can make little flashcards for that section. All right, I mentioned these already, so I'll let you take a look at these. Neuroendocrinology, the study of the interaction between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So you can't separate out the two because they're connected, because everything is in our brain. So our endocrine system is sending out hormones, and those various hormones may have an impact on our emotions, our cognition, our behavior. And so we have to look at that relationship whenever we're looking at our patients who are sick and we're trying to figure out what's going on with them. So neuroendocrine piece, and there's another chart about the hormones of the neuroendocrine system on page 40 and 41, shows you the different hormones coming from the different areas. Now this again is sort of basic anatomy. Posterior lobe has the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and then the anterior lobe has the growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic, prolactin, gonadotropic, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. So the pituitary gland, posterior and anteriorly, has many hormones coming from it. And then the chart is also going to show you the possible behavior correlations to altered secretion. So, and possible, functioning, what's happening. So what's the location? Antidiuretic hormone is in the posterior pituitary. Release is stimulated by dehydration, pain, and stress. The target organ is the kidney. The function is maintaining body water balance, right, and blood pressure. Possible behavior correlation, polydipsia, altered pain response, and modified sleep pattern. So even though you wouldn't think that ADH would have any impact on behavior, there is an impact, see? So this chart shows you the impact on the behaviors by the different hormones. So it's a fascinating chart, actually. I think it's really interesting. But some of these, you know, again, when it comes to the test taking, we're going to test you on some of these, so you have to know these. And then more about the pituitary gland or the circadian rhythms, because circadian rhythms follow a 24-hour cycle, or I think of it as the 24-hour clock. And if our clock is not is off in any way, we're going to show some behaviors related to that, right? So we call that, these rhythms can play a role in psychopathology if we don't get enough sleep, or, you know, people that work the night shift see it more often. Some of you who work nights, you can see the connection of how your clock cycle and your circadian rhythm can affect your behaviors. Genetics, you know what genetics is the study of biological transmission of characteristics. So the genotype and the phenotype. So what we represent, whether we have blue eyes, brown hair, whatever, we get that from our genes, right? And some of our behaviors also come from our parents. Studies have been connected to determining these background relationships. So, like, they look at twins and they see if they take the twins and they separate them in different areas of the country, do they still exhibit similar characteristics? And they have found that yes, they can. It's interesting. But they also have studies that look at, you know, environmental connections to psychiatric disorders. So they feel like, you know, yes, not only can your environment play a role, but your genetics and your environment combined can play a role. So there's a lot of research still going on about this, and there has been. You know, there's genetic links to things like Alzheimer's, saying that there's mutations on chromosome 21, 14, and 1. Okay, that's a study. Then there's relationships on the gene chromosome 19 that produces late onset Alzheimer's. Okay, that's another one. Then there's genetic variations in patients with things like ADHD, autism, bipolar disease, depression. So they've linked genes to these disorders, but it doesn't seem to be the only link. So sometimes there's a combination of things. Okay, so it's not just one thing, it's a combination. Here are some diagnostic procedures that we can do to assess mental health disorders. So we can do an EEG, testing the brain. How is the brain, the firing of the synapses and the nervous system, the neurons, and all that. We can look at we can assess the EEG, and it measures brain activity. It can also look at dysrhythmias, asymmetries, suppression of brain rhythms. It's used in diagnosing epilepsy, neoplasm, stroke, metabolic or degenerative diseases. Electrodes, of course, are placed on the scalp. And then amplitude and frequency of brain waves are recorded and measured and looked at. Okay. And then they have a computerized EEG mapping that they can do, looking at like a summary of the EEG tracings to try to make a pattern out of it, color coding the patterns and shading the gray patterns. It's used in research statistically between different groups of patients who have schizophrenia, for example. Patients who have seizures, for example, could also be some use for this. MRIs, they use MRIs to look at the structures of the brain. It's looking at mainly anatomical, biochemical stress, the structures, again, looking for defects, looking for edema, ischemia, infections, neoplasms, trauma. There's a chart about these, so you can kind of take a look at these different diagnostic procedures that can be done. And again, psycho neuroimmunology, the study